247, LD 265, an act to prohibit the Maine National Guard from combat deployment absent an act of the United States Congress, presented by Representative Himes of Waldo. Representative, you may proceed whenever you are ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, Senator Hickman, Representative Supika, and esteemed members of the Joint Standing Committee on Veterans and Legal Affairs. I am Representative Benjamin Himes, and I'm here today to present LD 265, an act to prohibit the Maine National Guard from combat deployments, absent an act of the United States Congress. Before I get too far into the bill, I believe it's very important to understand where someone is coming from when speaking on proposed legislation. I spent 20 years of my life on active duty in the United States Navy. I spent nearly 8 years of that time at the tip of the spear doing hundreds of frontline tactical combat missions during 12 combat deployments on 6 continents. I've seen the front lines of war. It was my job, and it is what I was rigorously selected, trained, tested, and deployed to do. I'm presenting this bill today because 2 years ago, when I spoke before this committee and on the House floor, I believed then, and I do now, in the Constitution of the United States and the checks and balances that it requires. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the U.S. Constitution clearly states that Congress, and Congress alone, has the ability to declare war and send our troops into harm's way. I firmly believe the framers intended this to ensure that the power to wage war did not solely rest on the president. Going to war is the hardest decision Congress has to make, and for good reason. It is our costliest behavior and endeavor, both financially in terms of our precious assets, our people, and our money. 24 years ago, in a moment of panic, Congress passed the Authorized Use of Military Force, AUMF, surrendering its authority and consolidating the power to the White House. This dangerous concentration of power defies the Constitution and absolves Congress of its responsibility. The Maine National Guard is a fine group of citizens that I have had the pleasure of working with. I first worked with them when I was on active duty, and we conducted joint service training on helicopter firefighting in Bangor, and now as a legislator during ceremonies and visits to the different camps and bases around the state of Maine. The job of a National Guardsman is first and foremost to be a citizen. They are all around us. They're nurses, lawyers, mechanics, etc. in our communities. That is their primary job. Being a soldier is secondary. They train in their specialty and aid in our state should the need arise while being prepared to do national level disaster relief and general security for our country. Further down this path as we go along, they ultimately take on the combat role. This is only after active and reserve units have been exhausted and the need for more troops arises based on attrition and losses, not as a ready frontline combat force. This bill does not prohibit the Guard from going anywhere else in the world to do anything else. Our strategic partnership with Montenegro stands unaffected. Training missions anywhere in the world would not be impacted. It does limit them from being sent into combat without a declaration of war issued by Congress. Bipartisan support for this type of legislation is spreading like wildfire across the country to protect our troops. As of today, this legislation has passed both in New Hampshire House of Representatives and the House of Delegates in Virginia. And as of note and of interest, the Virginia House voted 99-0 just last week to send this out. There were no party lines in that vote. It has passed also in the House and the Senate in Arizona and Idaho, and currently is being heard in Maryland, New Jersey, Montana, and here in Maine. The decision to go to war is hard, and it should be hard. It involves the lives and deaths of our finest citizens. Making tough decisions is what members of Congress are elected and paid to do. It's time to hold them to their constitutional obligations. The only argument from the previous Adjutant General was that someone somewhere in the Pentagon basement would cut off funding for the Maine National Guard if this bill was passed. However, when asked to identify this person or office, none was provided. If this concern arises again, I propose carrying this bill over and arranging a meeting during this break, the break between the two sessions, and that this committee, the bill sponsor, and relevant the Pentagon offices have the meeting to address this funding question directly. However, given that the Secretary of Defense has openly supported this bill, I highly encourage us to not waste money, save time, and save lives. Let's pass this bill unanimously out of committee and show the nation what it truly means to defend our National Guard. Thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Representative. The chair recognizes Representative Mallon with a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative, is there any difference at all between this bill and the one which was introduced in the 131st?
No.
Chair recognizes Representative Gramlich.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Representative. So I'm curious, I understand what the intent is and what you're trying to move forward on this, but I'm curious what would happen if troops are deployed, as you suggested in your testimony, anywhere throughout the world, and then a declaration of war was declared. What would happen to those troops?
If the declaration of war was declared, according to the Constitution, the way it's supposed to be done, the National Guard would be on the table as they would be if done properly.
You may proceed.
Thank you, Senator. So then would that mean if troops were deployed anywhere in the world and then subsequent to that, a declaration of war occurred, those troops would be pulled out?
My understanding is that is not how it would work.
So
Typically, when troops are sent somewhere, let's say if there's a conflict in, pick a country, we'll say Cuba. No, let's go Colombia. Let's say there was an outbreak in Colombia and we sent troops down there. And then after that, there was a declaration of war. The declaration of war is the trigger in the Constitution to be able to reach in and use our National Guard to be able to do that.
Okay.
Active and reserve would be used ahead of time. The intent of the National Guard is to be the last line of defense after active and reserves have been exhausted.
Okay.
And we have an attrition problem.
That's helpful. Thank you very much.
Chair recognizes Senator Timberlake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Representative Hines, for being here today. On the fifth paragraph of your testimony, you talk about the Authorized Use of Military Force Act that kind of came into play, or surrendering authority to the White House. And you say in this dangerously concentrates the power, defies the Constitution, and absolves Congress of its responsibility. My question to that is, if that's true, why hasn't someone, I mean, we're suing for everything in the world down there and going to court over everything in the world. Why hasn't somebody come to sue over this and have it declared unconstitutional? Because I think everybody thinks what they're doing is either constitutional or unconstitutional. And I don't know how you can say that it defies the Constitution and absolves the Congress of responsibility when nobody is sued to prove they had evidently what they think they've done. Why do you think that it's unconstitutional if it's at this point in time?
As stated in my testimony, it clearly states who has the ability to declare war. That has changed. There are good people that are in Congress, and there are good people that are in the Senate down in Washington, D.C. I don't always presume for them to do the right thing, unfortunately. And I also know that the gravity in the decision-making process to go to war is very heavy. A lot of the time, those decisions and that power and that responsibility that comes with making that declaration of war, people don't want. And they would prefer to pass that authority up and don't want that authority back. I would love for Congress to stand up and say, we did this, we're done with it, we'd like it back, and that's the way it should be. But there's not a, let's see the best way to put this. I do not have faith in the establishment within the Beltway that they will do the right thing and take their power back, because it is such an awesome and humbling and the biggest power that they have.
Hold on, please.
Senator may proceed.
So, Representative, I guess what I heard you say was that it's not unconstitutional. You just wish they'd take their power back because they've granted their power now to the White House.
It is unconstitutional because the Constitution says who can wage war. And
But
they're not doing
why
it
hasn't
anymore.
my question be then, you didn't answer why somebody hasn't sued to prove that wrong, because they could, if that was true, then somebody would have taken it to court to prove it's wrong. I don't believe that what you're saying is true. And I ask you why, again, you think it's unconstitutional when nobody has sued, and it says right here, and you say in your own statement that that power was granted to them by the Congress.
So the power to do that was not granted to Congress. The power was given to the White House by Congress. They are not taking that power back. And if nobody has chosen to sue the United States government on that, that is up to citizens to sue the United States government and that particular entity on that. However, it is very clear in the Constitution who's supposed to be waging war in this country. And it is very clear that 24 years ago, they didn't want to make those hard decisions. They gave that power to the White House, and they're not willing to take it back.
Thank you. I think you answered my question, that the White House has that power.
Are there any other questions for the bill sponsor from the committee? Your testimony says that the Secretary of Defense has openly supported this.
Yes, sir.
Do you have a citation for that?
Yes, I do. I have it. And there's also several other people that are going to come up after me to testify for this that also have the citation as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much for presenting the bill today. Is there anyone present who is the co-sponsor who wishes to testify on this bill? Seeing none, we'll take testimony from the general public. If you are present and wish to testify in favor of LD 265, please step forward.
It's a little leash, little
Good morning, Senator.
Good morning. I don't know that you still have to call me by that, but I appreciate all the same, Senator Hickman
That's what we do here.
and Representative Supika, members of the Committee on Veterans and Legal Affairs. I am former State Senator Eric Brakey, formerly representing the people of Auburn, New Gloucester, Poland, and Durham. Currently living in Dover, New Hampshire, where I am the executive director of the Free State Project, but I'm here today in my individual capacity, not on behalf of any organization. 2 years ago, I was before this committee with several others to present this very legislation. I think the bill sponsor has articulated many of the points well. I'll reinforce a few things, but I did want to highlight some developments over the last 2 years that for those who've been around for these conversations might find beneficial, and then I will go into some of the details. First, I'll say since the last time we had this before the committee, as was noted, the current U.S. Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, before he was Secretary of Defense, actually immediately following the passage of this legislation in the New Hampshire House of Representatives, was publicly on television saying, as a retired member of his own National Guard, what a great idea he thought it was because of the clear loss of checks and balances that has taken place over the last 20 years in the war on terror regarding the use of our National Guard for purposes beyond what they were originally envisioned for. And I'll also note that the incoming, likely to be confirmed today, as we're speaking right now, Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard is also on record supporting this legislation. It has passed several legislative bodies in the country, including the New Hampshire House of Representatives, the Idaho Senate, the Arizona Senate, and as noted, very recently, the Virginia House of Delegates passed this in a bipartisan 99-0 vote. Furthermore, I think for Republicans on the committee, I'll note it has been since adopted as a plank in the platform of the Maine GOP, the New Hampshire GOP, and the Texas GOP. And for Democrats on the committee, Donald Trump is president now, and I imagine you might not want him to have unchecked power over sending our troops into war without an act of Congress. So I think there's something in this for wherever you fall along partisan lines. There are reasons to support this legislation. As was noted, this legislation is fairly simple. The Constitution says explicitly that the militia, which we now today call the National Guard of the various states, may be called forward for combat purposes for 3 reasons and 3 reasons alone: to suppress insurrection, to repel invasion, to enforce the laws of the Union. And yet when you look at the ongoing occupation of a country like Syria, where we've been since 2014, like all the wars in the Middle East, where National Guard troops have accounted for almost 50% of troops on the ground. You look at Syria, we are not there to suppress an insurrection. Actually, we fomented an insurrection. We're not there to repel an invasion.
Ricky, I apologize. That was the 3-minute timer. So if you could wrap up your sentence. Thank you.
Okay. We were not there to repel an invasion. We're not there to enforce the law of the Union. The AUMF that was passed specifically was to go after Al-Qaeda, and in Syria we armed and aided Al-Qaeda. So it is hard to imagine that being the case. I'll just close. I just want to say one thing, and then I'm happy to take any questions. 2 years ago, with us in this committee room was Sergeant Aaron Rollins, who was a big advocate of this legislation. He's no longer with us, but I just wanted to relate to you very briefly something he said to me after the hearing 2 years ago, when so many of the arguments against this centered around money and concerns of loss of federal funds, which I've always believed is a paper tiger, and I think especially so with the Secretary of Defense now supporting this legislation. He turned to me outside in the hall and said, I wish that those who are so concerned about money would say that to the mother of my fallen friend in Iraq, that it was okay that he lost his life in an undeclared war because there were several Humvees that were gotten out of the deal. I think that there are higher principles at stake than just money, and I hope that we will take that into consideration. I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. Certainly, there's much more I could add, but I respect the committee's time.
Thank you, Senator. Are there any questions? Chair recognizes Representative Gramlich.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Mr. Brakey. Do you have a copy of your written testimony for the committee?
I did not bring any today, but I'd be happy to write some of these items down and submit it to the committee if that would be helpful.
Are there any other questions? Chair recognizes Representative Boyer.
Could you explain, Senator Brakey, about the differences in the two titles and just briefly go into, domestic missions versus overseas missions and that distinction for folks today?
Certainly. So there are two titles of the law in which the National Guard may be mobilized. If I had my written testimony from 2 years ago, I went into a little bit more in depth. I don't have it in front of me. I'd be happy to furnish that again. But ultimately, they can be mobilized under two titles, and the title for federal service for combat roles, is my understanding, it requires a clear, concrete declaration of war. Or if you're talking about people being put into a combat zone. Otherwise, the federal government may mobilize the National Guard for all sorts of training missions, including overseas, but we're talking about putting people into direct combat zones. And I'd be happy to get you further information. I'll grab my written testimony from 2 years, which went into that in depth, and I'll submit that to you all.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Senator Brakey from the committee? Seeing none. It's good to see you again.
Thank you very much. It was a longer drive than unusual, so it's good to see you all here.
Is there anyone else present who wishes to testify in favor of LD 265? In favor? Seeing none. Is there anyone present who wishes to testify in opposition to LD 265? Representative.
I'm gonna, hopefully I can speak long enough to get through my testimony, which is relatively short. Senator Hickman, Representative Supika, and distinguished members of the Veterans Legal Affairs Committee, my name is Representative Ken Burdett. I serve House District number 33, representing Dixmont, Etna, Newport, Plymouth, and Corinna. While I'm honored to serve as a member of this grand institution, known as the Maine House of Representatives, I'm also honored to serve as a colonel in the Maine National Guard. And this is a choice that I not only made once, but made twice as I became again an active member as a result of the attacks on the Twin Towers right after 9/11. The dual role that the National Guard plays is unique in our country in that we serve both a national role and a state role. As such, we have two bosses or commanders-in-chief, today being President Trump and Governor Mills. For the most part, a member, when I say member, and I'll use the term traditional member, a traditional member of the Maine National Guard will generally spend most of their military career in state, gaining skills and performing mission essential functions, both state and federal. With all due respect to the sponsors of this bill, in my opinion, this bill would devastate that role and as a result put at risk literally hundreds of millions of dollars and risk long-term damage to our perception as a partner in our blended military infrastructure. I strongly urge you to vote ought not to pass on this legislation. With that, I'll answer any questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative. Chair recognizes Representative Mallon.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative. Glad you're able to make it. It's been suggested that the context has changed since the last time this bill was introduced. What do you have to say about that? What would your response be to that assertion?
You know, I don't think that it has changed. I think there may be some clarifying comments that will come out in the near future about that because this is just incompatible. You know, we essentially have your active duty. That's your traditional, what I would say, person who gets out of high school, goes into active duty, maybe does 4 years, 6 years, 8 years. Then you have your what you might call active duty reserve. Those are people that maybe after they get out doing their 4 years, they stay part of what we call Big Air Force, and they do a weekend a month and whatnot. And those two are sort of national in nature. The militia, which frankly was founded when we separated from England and declared our independence, and that's sort of the National Guard today. And we primarily are always in a state mission mode. I think the good representative asked a question, Representative Boyer had asked a question about titles. Essentially, you have two titles, Title 32 and Title 10. For the most part, in my career, and I'm a pretty traditional guy, 25 years, I'll retire in April. I've served probably 98% of that time in the state of Maine. And that's just because of the nature of my job, my training and whatnot. And so for the most part, people will serve in that title, but we have to have the ability to have that National Guard be able to go overseas or to stay in country if some other folks need to go overseas. So I think there's going to be clarification on that wouldn't be consistent with this bill.
Chair recognizes Representative Graham.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Representative. I'm really grateful that you're able to join us to provide your perspective, particularly in light of all the important responsibilities you have on the Appropriations Committee. My question is relative to what the bill sponsor referenced as the constitutional and United States checks and balances. And I wonder if you can just speak to that.
Well, I am an attorney, and look, sometimes, the Constitution grows and whatnot, but look, again, it's a dual system. We have a federal Constitution, we have a state Constitution. I was here the other day talking about our federal Uniform Code of Military Justice and our state code of military justice, and we have these two systems, and we sort of exist in these two systems. And again, for the most part, we are always going to be in a state status. Now, if there's a federal crisis, the President of the United States has the ability to say, hey, Ken Fredette, you need to come help us out. And that's going to be in a rare circumstances. That's not going to be typical. And it's usually going to be for a short period of time. Maybe we need to get out on the border. Maybe we need to go down to DC. Maybe we need to go to North Carolina and help people out of a crisis. But those are exceptional circumstances, usually for an extremely short period of time. And again, I think this bill, it provides some confusion to where and when we can play that role. And I just fear what the loss would be for Maine if Maine were to do this by itself.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for Representative Fredette? Chair recognizes Senator Timberlake.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Fredette, for being here today. Representative Gremlin's question was, and you wasn't in the room.
Ramlick.
I'm sorry. Turn the thing this way, and I won't remember it next time, but I'll get it right. Just throw something at me. Just hit me. It's all right. I don't mind. She hits me all the time. But anyway, well, they could see it. It's not fair. I'm sorry. I really apologize. Yeah, well, I don't know my own name. But anyway, on page, on paragraph 5 of Ben Himes, he talks about when he asks about the constitutionality. And on 24 years ago, in a moment of panic, the Congress passed authorizing the use of military force act, surrendering its authority, consolidating the powers of the White House, endangers the constrained power, defies the Constitution, it absolves the So with the knowledge that the Congress passed that power onto the White House, in your opinion as a lawyer, and somebody worked there, does that now give the president the power to institute, what is it, Title 10 or Title 32, whatever it is?
I mean, obviously, anytime Congress speaks, and particularly in regards to delegating any sort of authority, and we do that here all the time, right? We delegate to the commissioner to promulgate rules for pharmacy prescriptions or whatnot. So anytime we do that and we grant that authority, that is usually interpreted as a very broad authority. And I think in that particular certain set of circumstances, I think it's been broadly interpreted, obviously, and I certainly think it's constitutional.
And they haven't rescinded that power to your knowledge? at
Not
this
to my
point in time?
knowledge.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Representative Fredericks.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for being here, Representative Fredette. So I'm not understanding how it devastates the role, the risk. Help me to understand your point again.
Well,
And I heard you loudly.
Yeah, so-
You'd use different terms.
Yeah, no, no, let me try to,
Frustrator.
let me try to put it in a circumstance that makes sense. So even though we have some territories, I'll just talk about the 50 states, right? And somewhere down in Washington DC, there's this body called National Guard Bureau and the Secretary of Defense. But the point of it is, if you're planning for war, right? I mean, that's what we do, right? We have to protect ourselves, and you're planning for war, and you have a chessboard in front of you, but one of those 50 are no longer in play. So we're going to say, okay, we're going to take Maine off the map. Okay, so now we got 49 states that I got to work with. And let's say this, even New Hampshire does the same thing. Now we got 48 states, right? And I'm planning for war. And I've got to figure out how to allot equipment, money, assets. And I got to figure out how I'm going to do that. Are we going to send money to Maine? Are we going to train people in Maine? Are we going to keep that wing up at the 101st Air Refueling Wing in Maine? Or are we going to put it down in New York where that's going to be on the map so that we can move those pieces around? I think that's what I'm trying to say. Does that answer your question?
Representative may proceed.
No, sir.
Okay.
So let me try to rephrase my question.
Okay.
As I understand the bill, is it not proposing that a single party versus a collective party is the decision maker to enact war, hence deploy the National Guard?
Well,
Is that-
so I guess if you're asking me a constitutional question, and does the president, in two circumstances, obviously they would. If Congress obviously gives the president the power to go do this, absolutely. You know, but we have a long history of where even George Bush, but even lots of people have deployed forces, even in Israel today. I mean, we've deployed, resources over there to deal with a crisis. So do I think they both have that power, and should they both have that power to the extent that, do I think the chief executive, the president, has that power? Absolutely. And should he or she have? Yes.
The chair recognizes Representative Frost.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative. I guess my question is, you keep talking about Maine standing alone, but in Representative Himes' testimony, it does say that as of today, this legislation has passed in both New Hampshire, Virginia House of Delegates. It's on the table in many other states. So I don't understand why we'd be alone if other states are, deciding to change things.
But I think this is a conversation that states are having. I don't think it's unique just to Maine. Oftentimes, we see bills in Maine that are not unique just to Maine. There are multiple states where those efforts get made. So, it wouldn't surprise me that this is something being talked about in all 50 states. I don't think that necessarily means it's good policy. But it obviously, the saying is sometimes is said, Maine's a good target for sometimes a lot of folks to come in and pass something, because then they can say, well, Maine did it, so let's do it in Oklahoma, or Maine did it, so let's do it in Florida. So I think we just need to be cautious. I mean, that's all I'm saying.
The representative may proceed with a question for clarity.
Right, I guess I'm still not understanding. It sounds like you're saying Maine would be the first, but it doesn't seem that we are the first.
No, I'm not saying that we are the first. What I'm saying is, and I wouldn't be surprised if in Virginia, one branch passes it. But as we all know, you have to pass it in the House, the Senate, the governor's got to sign on to it. So again, do I foresee that there are places where a bill will get a foothold in one or two places? Absolutely, because that's what I would do if I was trying to get a bill passed, and you look at the states and see who might be more receptive to this. But, this is a Maine bill. How does this apply to Maine? That's what I'm concerned about.
Chair recognizes Representative Boyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Representative Fredette. Since you're a lawyer and Senator Timberlake's question kind of piqued my interest, who would you suppose has standing to sue, I don't know, Congress or the president?
Standing to do what?
Or maybe you weren't in the room. Senator Timberlake was asking the bill sponsor why no one, if this is unconstitutional, then how come no one's ever sued before? So I was wondering.
Well, you have to have standing, and so what that would mean is, first of all, you'd have to have a bill, right? You'd have to have a law. And then in order to have standing, you have to have an alleged violation of that law. And then in order to have an alleged violation of the law, you usually need someone that's been damaged or somehow impacted by that law. So the court's not going to give an advisory opinion on something. So, I mean, I think in order to have standing, you have to have a ripe issue. And I don't think that this issue is ripe at this point in time for any court to make a decision on that. And there's other lawyers in the room, but I think that's generally how I'd describe it.
I want to interrupt with a question, and I'll let you follow up, Representative Boyer. But on that, would a surviving member of a National Guard member lost in a deployment that was not part of a declaration of war perhaps have standing?
Well, that would be me providing a legal opinion, and that might be malpractice. And so without knowing all the facts of the case, I will not answer that question.
Representative Boyer may proceed.
You mentioned ripeness and law, Representative Fredette. Where does the Constitution fall on the law? The Constitution is the law, right?
It's the supreme law of the land.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions for Representative Fredette? Chair recognizes Representative Speaker.
Thank you, Representative, for being here today.
Thank you, ma'am.
You, in your, when you're answering one of the questions, you mentioned that it's like rare and like it's rare for the Guard to be deployed and it's for short term. I didn't write everything that you said down there, but I was wondering, so the way things stand right now, currently President Trump could deploy the Maine Guard to the Gaza Strip if he so wished. And is there anything that we would be able to do to stop that? Or would there be any timeline? You say it's rare and it's short. Like, is any of that in law, or are there any checks and balances there to control something like that?
Well, I'm going to let General Dunn answer that question, but I think oftentimes, I think we've all seen, particularly in these long wars that we've seen of the last couple decades, people typically would have deployments of 4 months, 6 months, maybe a year. Then they come back home. Maybe they go back overseas, but typically with Guard members, what my observation has always been is that they know that employers are reliant upon us. So if I work for FedEx or UPS, we as the Guard, when I say the Guard, I mean, I think the institution recognize that we have a responsibility to UPS as well. And so, the theory usually isn't that we're going to deploy someone for 2 years and leave UPS without an employee. And so that's all sort of part of the mix and the conversation when those sorts of things happen, depending upon the circumstances. And I'm sure General Dunn can speak more to that, but typically they're a short duration.
And then a follow-up to that. And then it was also mentioned that a lot of times there's like a progress of, we'll send in the reserves first. And is that something that's in statute, or is it also just sort of could be at the whim of the current president to decide?
Yeah, I mean, I think, generally speaking, my guess would be is there's plans in place for that. I mean, somebody who's on active duty is signed up for active duty. What that means is, if there's going to be some sort of action, they're probably going to be the first to go. The reserves, they're going to be second. My guess would be typically but it's a mix. We have a blended response team, and I think everybody sort of understands the uniquenesses of all of those.
So I apologize, but I guess I'll be more direct with my questions.
Yep.
In this, in this scenario, could a president decide to just say, I want to send the Guard, and just bypass whomever and just make a decision under the system that we have now?
I think that would be extreme, and I don't think that that is something that would happen. So I don't think, I guess in the worst case of hypotheticals.
Yeah, hypotheticals.
I would have to say no, because I don't think that would ever happen.
Okay, so you don't think it would happen, but the way that the system is now, it like, technically it could.
I'm going to say no.
Okay.
Chair recognizes the Representative Boyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to ask this to General Dunn as well, but perhaps you know or have firsthand experience. My understanding is the National Guard has been used as a supplemental force for our military, for active duty deployment, for overseas conflict. And my understanding is that the National Guard has made up all the way up to 50% of the fighting force in some cases at some times. Is that number accurate, give or take to you?
And I'm going to let General
Okay.
Dunn again answer that question. But again, I think it depends on the mission. You know, there's some things that the Guard does specifically that they do well. They do it less expensive than active duty. So I think it depends on what the specific mission requirements are.
Representative C.
You piqued my curiosity. Why is it cheaper for the National Guard to do it sometimes?
Well, they're only paying us sometimes 2 days out of a month versus somebody being paid 30 days out of a month.
Chair recognizes Senator Timberlake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative, you've been serving in the Guard, I think you said for 25 years or thereabouts, 20
Yep.
years.
Yep.
Do you feel that the majority of the Guard members, when they sign up to go in the Guard, understand that they can be deployed and know what's going on?
I think they do, and I think they sign up in part just because of that. You know, people on this committee probably know I'm from a little town of Danforth, and you know, I've had the opportunity to go to Turkey, to go to England, you know, all over the country. Those are things I would have never done had I not joined the Guard, and not only that, but to meet people that are, you know, really just well-intentioned people. I think if you meet anyone today that's either been in the military or are in the military, they do it because of the public service. They don't do it necessarily for the money. They're just great people, and I think they're willing to help out in times of crisis, whether it's going overseas or helping somebody out down in North Carolina. So I think they sign up. They know what they're signing up for. And then typically, you know, look, if somebody wants to get out, they can find a way to get out. You know, it's not necessarily probably difficult to get out if you want to get out.
So, quick follow. So in your opinion, most people that are signing up today know that they could be deployed to anywhere in the world at any time to go to any war, and it's not something that's a surprise to them when it happens.
I think 99.9% of them do.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Representative Stett from the committee? Seeing none, thank you for being.
Have a great day, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anyone else present who wishes to testify in opposition to LD 265? Good afternoon, General Dunn and Commissioner. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Senator Hickman, Representative Topeka, and honorable members of the Joint Standing Committee on Veterans and Legal Affairs. I am Diane Dunn, Commissioner of the Department of Defense, Veterans and Emergency Management, and the Adjutant General for the Maine National Guard. I'm here to testify in opposition of LD 265, an act to prohibit the Maine National Guard from combat deployment absent an act of the United States Congress. First, I'd like to note that our Maine National Guard service members join our all-voluntary force for a variety of reasons, such as opportunity and a sense of duty, with the understanding that they are subject to orders to deploy in support of federal missions. And they willingly sign up for that responsibility in service to our great country. I'm proud to have taken that oath to serve many decades ago, and to continue to swear in new service members with the same desire. While I appreciate the good intentions behind the legislators who brought forward this bill, I am concerned that it will not have the desired effect, and its passage would be counterproductive to our shared interest of the state of Maine and its people. I'll address three primary issues: the federal powers, Supreme court precedents, and funding. While LD 265 aims to give greater state control to how and when the Maine National Guard is deployed, Congress is the only body that can pass laws to affect overseas contingency operations. Maine National Guard members are part of a dual enlistment system. We take both a state and federal oath of office. We hold both state and federal status and are members of both the armed forces of our state of Maine and the United States. Under current federal law, the federal government has the ability to activate National Guard members for federal service without obtaining the governor's consent to do so. And in 1990 case of Perpich versus the Department of Defense, the Supreme Court of the United States unanimously decided to uphold the constitutionality of the dual enlistment system and Congress's supremacy over the states in matter of defense. Regarding the funding, the Maine National Guard receives a majority of our operating budget and equipment from the federal government, which results in a strong return on investment for the state of Maine. The federal government provides such funding since the Maine National Guard primary focus is to support the federal mission to fight and win our nation's wars and defend the homeland. However, that funding, organizing, and equipping of our federally recognized units here in the state of Maine also readies our units for use within the state for local emergencies, such as our Black Hawk helicopters that are used to rescue injured hikers off Katahdin several times a year, and most recently, the use of the Lakota helicopter to assist Maine wardens to locate 2 lost men near Suncazen and Black Horse Stream back in December. Passing this legislation may signal to the federal government that we're an unreliable partner and risk the allocation of equipment, funding, and manning to other states, thus undercutting our valuable capability for the state of Maine. Our Maine National Guard service members face a choice when deciding to serve in the armed forces. They may elect to join the active duty, the reserves, or the National Guard. Maine National Guard advantage is that our service members can deploy on federal missions while proudly living and serving here in the state of Maine. I ask that you consider the consequences of the bill and oppose it. My team and I will be available in the work session to address any specific questions. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you, General Dunn. Chair recognizes Representative Mallon with a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for being here, General Dunn. Are you, from other than comments made by a cable TV news host, are you aware of any changes in federal policies regarding the Guard? Like actual changes in federal policies?
No.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for General Dunn from the committee? Senator Timberlake?
Yeah, if we pass this, what are the repercussions for the state of Maine, in your opinion? What could be the repercussions that happen to the state of Maine?
There would be several repercussions, and I would base it on the testimony that I just provided. First and foremost, it would impact those members that are living and working and serving here in the state of Maine that choose to do that for those opportunities and the ability to serve not only here in the state of Maine, but nationally, globally. And so for limiting or the perception of taking away that opportunity if Maine is not considered a good federal partner could be devastating to our recruiting opportunities, as well as the available resources that we have, federal property, federal equipment that the federal government funds the state of Maine that we use in domestic operations. Those would be 2 of the primary impacts that I would see.
Senator, may proceed.
Thank you. General, I think when I think of the Guard, I think of all the things that the Maine National Guard has done. It's always very proud of them, but one of the things you always hear about is how our Guard out of Bangor takes their refueling wing and goes out and refuels everything all over the world and flies everywhere. Would you be nervous that refueling wing that sits at Bangor, if we passed a bill like this, that the federal government would say, well, maybe we're not going to send any more up there and we should move that refueling wing to New York or wherever it may be, that they have another refueling wing in order to just to make sure that everything happens in a timely fashion when they need that help. Could you see that as a possibility of being out there?
Yes, Senator, I could see that as a possibility. I think more importantly, we have our units and our resource here in the state of Maine that are federally funded, federally resourced. We are here to train for that federal mission. So we use our equipment, the refueling, for that purpose, is to be ready if called. And so if for whatever reason the federal government decided not to have those resources here in the state of Maine, we have those limited options for those that choose to serve and want to stay here in Maine.
Thank you, Jen.
Are there any other questions from the Committee for General Dunn? Chair recognizes Representative Topeka.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, General Dunn. In your testimony, sorry, I was trying to follow along and write my notes as I went on, and I'm not the most organized. Here we go. So you say, you don't think that those who brought forward the bill would have the desired effect. It seems that, and then you talk about in the next paragraph, it seems like some of the history of how we've come to where we are today, which was that Congress is the only body that can pass laws to affect overseas contingency operations. Is that currently how it is right now? Only Congress can pass laws to affect overseas contingency operations?
That is my understanding, yes, Representative.
Okay. What does laws that to affect overseas contingency operations mean? Like what is an example of that? And how does that connect with the fact that the president could call up the reserves to go into war right now? Like how do those two relate to each other?
So Representative, my understanding is based on the language of this bill is to prohibit the Maine National Guard from combat deployment absent an act of Congress.
Okay.
My point is that Congress, regardless, the language says we're going to prevent the Maine National Guard from doing any overseas deployment absent combat. Congress is the one. So a bill in the state of Maine that says the Maine legislature could pass this bill and say, Maine, you can't take your National Guard into combat. Current federal laws, as upheld in 1990 and elsewhere, the Supreme Court have said Congress is the only one that can say that. So this bill is, in my opinion, inferring that the state of Maine could prevent our National Guard from being called. I don't understand how that could be, given the current powers of Congress.
Clarifying. So if I understand correctly, because Congress has given the president this right to declare war and call upon the National Guard, then that's an extension of Congress's decision. Is that what you're?
I'm only presenting the facts that I understand. Yeah. Congress, by the Constitution, has the power to call units into combat.
Okay.
My understanding of this bill is that Maine National Guard would be prevented based on this bill. I don't see the correlation. Because Congress could say in our federal status, we have two statuses, Maine National Guard, you're going to be federalized and you're going to go here, there, or wherever. If Congress says that, regardless of a LD 265, we would be required, based on our authorization, our oath, to deploy to wherever Congress tells us to deploy.
Representative Topeka, do you have any other clarifying questions?
Oh, I have all kinds of clarifying questions, but I'm going to think on them because I know we'll have time for this. Yeah.
The chair recognizes Representative Boyer, and there will be a work session.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, General Dunn. I'm not trying to be cute here, but logistically, who makes the decision when to send our National Guard overseas to combat?
In a Title 10 status, our federal government.
Is that Congress? Is that the president?
A federal government.
Okay. And then logistically, when the federal government says that, who does the governor or do you agree or consent, or how does that work with our leadership in the state regarding those orders from the federal government?
If we are given orders by the federal government to deploy a unit, then because of our dual status, we deploy in a federal status.
So again, logistically, there's no decision to be made locally here in Maine when that happens.
When the federal government calls you and gives you an order as a unit to deploy in a federal status, based on our dual status, we deploy. Based on orders from the federal government.
How familiar, you referenced in this court case, 1999, Perfect versus Department of Defense. Are you aware that this was regarding training and not combat exercises?
I'm not an expert on that particular case, and I'd be happy to explore it more during the work session, particularly with our legal subject matter experts to get into the detail of it. Yep.
And Mr. Chair,
May I proceed?
were you aware that what prompted that court case to the Supreme Court, that challenge, was two governors, including Joseph Brennan of Maine, refusing to allow the deployment of the National Guard for training missions in Central America?
No, Representative, I was not aware of that.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Follow up, please.
May I proceed?
Could you drill, where is it coming from that we're gonna lose funding if we pass that? Like, can you, for the work session, if you can't expel now, just some quotes from some people that say something a little bit more definitive than it might happen?
Absolutely, we can provide you that in the work session. Additionally, it's not just about the funding, it's about the resources, the equipment, the organization of the units that we have here in Maine to prepare, train, and be ready to defend for a federal mission. If the state of Maine is seen as not a federal partner, what is the incentive for the federal government to keep those organizations, those units here in Maine? But happy to provide you the latest transformation information that is ongoing at the Department of Defense level, looking for how do we become a more lean fighting organization prepared to protect the nation and defend the nation. So I can say that there are ongoing discussions about what the future of our military is and what those type of units are. And we can provide you additional information.
Mr. Chair,
Representative, you may proceed.
who is discussing that?
Is ongoing every 5 years, and I'll give you the technical information for what the force structure, what the needs are of the active component, the reserve component, and the National Guard, and how we each have a share in our federal operational plans that are the plans that protect the nation.
Thank you.
One or two more, real quick.
The representative may proceed with two more clarifying
Two more, all
questions,
right.
and then anything else can be reserved for the work session. Thank you.
Do you think that Senator Collins, who's now the chair of the appropriation, would put our funding at risk if our legislature decides to do this?
I'm not in a position to comment on what Senator Collins may or may not do, Representative.
And are you aware of recent statements by President Trump stating that FEMA is a disaster, quote, and might go away?
Representative, I'm not sure how that's relevant to LD 265.
Happy to explain.
There is a point of order that this question is not germane to this legislation, and the chair would rule that it is not germane to this legislation, Representative Boyer. Do you have another question that is germane to this legislation in this moment?
My understanding is the National Guard, again, supplements active duty. Was I accurate in my statistic that it has been up to 50% of the active fighting force?
The National Guard represents 40% of the combat force for the United States.
My final question, Mr. Chair, is do you have concerns that if our Maine National Guard men and women are deployed overseas, that we wouldn't be ready for disasters and domestic things if we're over in the Gaza Strip?
That's exactly why the Maine National Guard has core competencies in all of the 10 critical domestic operations lanes so that we can support both our federal and state mission.
Thank you. Are there any other questions from the committee for General Dunn? For the public hearing, if you think of any between now and the work session, please submit them to our analyst. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for your time.
No worries. Is there anyone else present who wishes to testify in opposition to LD 265? Seeing none. Anyone present who wishes to testify neither for nor against LD 265? Seeing none. Are there any questions or information requests for the analyst? Chair recognizes Representative Boyer.
I'd like more interest in the, more information in the court case that was referenced in the general's testimony. I'd like data on historic levels of Maine National Guardsmen as active duty component. It's said it's 40%. Has it always been 40? Has it been less? Has it been more? That's what I got for now.
Anyone else have information requests? Chair recognizes Representative Chapman.
Thank you, Chair. Could I get total number of units, and maybe by each unit, and number of months deployed since '01 from the state of Maine National Guard? Thank you.
Any other information requests for the analyst? Chair recognizes Representative Hines.
I have one request. I'd like to know how many Maine National Guardsmen have died in combat in the last 20 years for the work session.
Any other information requests? Chair recognizes Representative Boyer.
Mr. Chair, would it be appropriate if our analysts reach out to the Pentagon for how they would react to this bill if we were to pass it?
It would be appropriate.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Any other information requests? Seeing none, the chair closes the public hearing on LD 265.